if you're feeling anxious about the way you're interacting with your team or with your manager, if you don't feel valued or like you're seen as someone whose experience is important, that's going to impact your sense of worth at work. It's going to eventually impact your motivation. It's going to impact things like your performance. And so I think it's really important that we think about our colleague experience as if they're a type of customer of the organization.
Hello, and welcome to the Plumm Pod, where we talk about all things HR and mental health. I'm your host, Georgia, and founder of Access HR. And if you want to think differently, this is definitely the episode for you. Today, I'm joined by Megan Trotter, Senior People Experience Partner, and she brings light to people experience compared with the traditional HR. Megan has leaned into her design background and she shares insights and frameworks for a more people-centric approach to work. Megan, hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here.
I'm really excited for this conversation, and I know it will open up the minds and hearts of a lot of our listeners. And before we get into it and we give too much away, I would love if we can talk a little bit about you and really set the scene a little bit. And the question that I love to ask every single guest is, was HR part of the plan, or did this happen by chance?
I love this question because it's kind of a no to both, actually. On the one hand, I never intended to go into this space, but on the other hand, I think I've been really intentional about my career. I actually started out in architecture. So I grew up thinking that I would take over my dad's family architectural business, which he took over from his dad. So it was all primed. And look, I loved studying architecture. I loved all the design side of it, but I realized I didn't want to be an architect. So I then transitioned into interactive and visual design and then user experience. So that was the first pivot, if you like. And it was through my time in user experience, actually, that I started to realize that actually a big part of delivering great user experiences also required organizational change to become more user-centric. And some of the biggest blockers I faced in my career as a UXer were often around bringing people on the journey and getting, especially software engineers, I think, to think about the desirability aspect of work. We often talk about desirability, feasibility, viability in the product space. And I very quickly realized that actually the feasibility side of things was often down to whether the software engineers were treated well, whether they had, psychological safety, the capacity that they needed to deliver. And that's when I really became really interested in the world of culture, the world of people experience. And because I'd made that shift from architecture into design, where the design process was similar, I started to wonder, could you design for your colleague experience or people experience the same way you do for your users or even in other fields of design? So it wasn't where I thought I would end up. But I feel I've always stayed in the world of design and I still feel like a designer today. It's just the content of what I'm designing has changed over time.
And with your approach, I think there's so much that we can learn as well, because now you are Senior People Experience Partner and you are UX turned PX by your LinkedIn profile there. And what I would really love for us today is to focus on people experience, as this may be really not known to a lot of people, especially if they've been within the traditional HR landscape for all of their career, but potentially they want to be more creative and they're wanting to adopt more design into a really robust experience at work. How would you define employee experience for somebody who's never heard of it before?
I think about this a lot, actually, because when you go to parties and people ask what you do, you've got to explain how people experience is different to HR. I often say people experience is essentially customer experience, but for your colleagues. And to bring that to life, using a metaphor from the world of customer experience. I have my favorite coffee shop I go to every Sunday, and I get served by someone who's learned my name, learned my order, really treats me like it's my own home or like I'm visiting a friend. But recently I've had someone who serves me who just treats me like another transaction. And I get the sense that they're more interested in moving me along and getting my order completed rather than my experience. And I think the impact of that has been actually, I've noticed when I go in for a coffee on a Sunday, I'm almost nervous about who I'm going to be interacting with. If you translate that to the world of work, if you're feeling anxious about the way you're interacting with your team or with your manager, if you don't feel valued or like you're seen as someone whose experience is important, that's going to impact your sense of worth at work. It's going to eventually impact your motivation. It's going to impact things like your performance. And so I think it's really important that we think about our colleague experience as if they're a type of customer of the organization.
I love that. And the breakdown and the example, I think, will actually start to open people's minds to the reality of that experience. It's more about optimizing the employee experience at every stage of the life cycle and thinking beyond the traditional. I am definitely guilty of this within my career. I've been in the HR landscape for nearly 10 years. And I've always been down that traditional path, and I desperately don't want to be there. Got more of a creative brain, and hearing from yourself how much value it's bringing, I know so many people will really want to relate to that. Do you have any recommendations for somebody who previously, like me, is stuck or feels like they are stuck within the traditional route, and how they can start to move more into PX?
Yeah, I think there's probably 4 kind of key skills I would recommend people start to learn. And they are first strategic thinking. So really trying to understand what the business is trying to achieve and how your work feeds into that. I mean, we know that when someone has a positive experience at work, they're something like 16 times more engaged, they're 40% more high performing. And so you can start to see directly how improving the experience can link to business outcomes, but you need to be able to talk about that with the business. The other thing I would think about is, and this is a key difference, I think, between traditional HR and people experience, is really trying to uncover the root cause of whatever it is that you're trying to solve. We can jump so quickly to solutions, but it's kind of like if you go to the doctor and you've got itchy skin and they just give you something topical to put on it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go away. You've just treated the symptom. And I think that's a kind of analogy in people experience by really trying to uncover what is the true problem we're trying to solve so that we can have the greatest impact, and then look at creative ways of solving that. And like you said, really allowing your creative brain to think broadly about what the options available are and then iterating on that solution. And I think to get started in that area, it's often just about having a go, asking good questions, being curious. And I think we talked earlier about this idea of taking off your expert hat and actually becoming more of a facilitator. Sometimes that can feel a little scary because we've been trained to know what to do if this situation happens or if that situation happens. But I think by becoming a facilitator of the creation of that people experience rather than determining these kind of set processes, it really can help to unleash the potential of our people and create positive change.
The facilitation, I'm going to talk about that. There is such a shift happening at the moment where, as a people, and we are still, of course, called HR as well, but as a function and as a team, moving towards being more of the coaching, taking more of a coaching approach, taking that facilitation approach. And when I first looked into people experience, I didn't realize the potential with it. And I think there's a lot of us where we're thinking, okay, how can I start to better understand and implement people experience when I've never done it before? Like how, so taking your 4 points that you've just said then, how can I start to sow the seeds?
I would definitely recommend to people learning different skills by, reading, listening to podcasts like this one. I think the way that I went about this in my career was often, attending conferences, workshops, some kind of training. There are loads of trainings now around this idea of people experience as a product. And just being amongst other people who are learning the same concepts and the same methodologies and some of the frameworks that we can use can really help to inspire you to start to take some action. I think that's kind of the first step, is just filling your brain with alternative ways of working. And then the next step is having the courage to apply those in practice, because, it's only through experimentation, I think, that we learn what works and what doesn't, especially in our context. Some organizations, especially startups, are very fast-paced. Sometimes they aren't so open to the idea of, the perfect design process.
Yep.
And so you have to find ways to adapt different methodologies. For example, if you're looking at personas are a really great tool for understanding your users' needs or wants or desires, and really getting a sense of what that person is that you're trying to deliver an experience for. But you don't need to do that in like a fully fledged way. You can kind of pick and choose little pieces and test different things.
The testing side, for me, was revolutionary. And I think a lot of the time where we potentially fall foul a little bit in HR is we try to just put a solution in. We try to just put it in place, hope it works. More often than not, it doesn't. And then we're frustrated. Why are the team not using it? But the reality is we're not actually building a product that is actually going to facilitate and enable the experience that we're hoping for. We're just approaching it the wrong way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think kind of like that example I gave earlier about the coffee shop. If you're focused on what needs to be done,
Yep.
then you're probably not going to think that much about what the experience you're trying to drive is. Whereas if you start from the perspective of what is the experience that we're trying to create, how are we trying to unlock our people and their potential, then you can really create change. So the way I would do that is actually taking some time to get out from behind your desk and go and observe people in their day-to-day work. If you're thinking about a career progression piece of work, for example, actually going and asking people, what does career progression mean to you, and what is important to you when it comes to career progression? And you might hear things like, actually, all that matters to me is that my manager really takes an interest in where I take my career. That's a very different problem to solve than, I don't know what career paths are available to me at this organization. And I think by taking that time to really understand who you're designing for, it already takes you so much closer to impact in terms of what your solution will be, because you're really clear on this being something that will solve a problem not just for the business, but also for the people. And then once you have some idea of who you're designing for and what their needs are, then it's about actually involving them in that design process a little more, running some workshops around, okay, if you want your manager to take a greater interest in your career, how might we encourage that? What would that look like? What would that feel like? And actually getting people to bring their ideas. And that can also be a really great way to get some buy-in in whatever the solution is, and make people feel positive that this is an organization that really cares about me and my needs and what I want from work as well. And, actually, it's something like 79% of people now really expect their organization to create value for them as human beings. So I think it's so important that we, involve our people in these processes.
That is such a powerful reminder, actually, why we need to be designing experiences with our people in mind and the end user experience. I've not heard that statistic before. So I absolutely love that. And what I really love is we're actually building a fully fledged experience from end to end. It's not in silo anymore. We're thinking it throughout the entire time. And even as I'm sat here, I'm thinking about, oh, what about this and what about that? And where I would love to get an understanding. So when you were in UX and then getting to your first PX role, how was that for you? How did you make that transition from customer and user into people?
Yeah, really interesting question. I think firstly, I built relationships with the leaders who I was working with a lot of the time, who were often directly responsible for their team's experience. I think the first thing I ever did, there's a tool called culture mapping by a company called Xplane. And I noticed that it was the culture of the team that was getting in our way of delivery. And I said, I'd love to run this workshop with you leaders to see if there's a way that we can start to create some change in the way we're delivering. That was just the very first thing I ever did, just starting to experiment. When I moved, so I'm from Australia, when I first moved to London, or when I was moving to London, I was very conscious that I wanted to position myself as not just another UX person, but someone who was thinking more broadly about the impact of culture on your ability to deliver digital solutions. And when I was working in the first company that I worked for in London, I managed to somehow convince our head of people of this idea of applying design processes and design thinking in the HR space. And we worked together to convince my managing director to allow me to work 1 day a week in the people team. And originally it kind of started out as like doing UX work, but for people projects. And very quickly I realized there's not that much I could do 1 day a week because it was slowing things down. So in the end, it started to become more about teaching that team some of the design processes. And when they had a new initiative coming up, we would actually scope it out in terms of, rather than just putting something in place and a solution in place, I'd really try to encourage them to think about what's the problem we're trying to solve, and then how could we identify whether that's the true problem, run some focus groups or interviews, that kind of thing, come up with some solutions together with people and then iterate on it. And that was really the first step for me, was just getting exposure. I think because I wasn't sure whether this approach could work in the people space, just as it does in UX, it was really, it was about experimenting and seeing what worked and what didn't.
And what response did you get from the head of people when you first approached them, coming at the HR perspective and the people perspective from a design lens?
Well, it was quite funny actually, because I think it was my managing director. I'd said something about, we should be running some training on feedback because it's a really important thing. And the head of people found out about it and was like, this is kind of something that HR does. And when I explained why I was interested in this and what my vision was, I suppose, she actually was, I think, quite taken aback in a good way. It was like, I could see the light bulb come on and her get excited about it. And as we worked through it, I think she could see the value in it. I think, that I have had leaders that have said that they're interested in this approach or have shown some initial interest, but then when the business kind of is under pressure, or when you become under pressure to perform, it can be really easy to just fall back into old ways. And so it can be difficult, I guess, to get the buy-in sometimes. But it's really just about trying to take small steps and show the value of a people experience approach to things over time.
A really important thing that you just said there is about showing. And a lot of the time, I think what is really missing here is around the engagement and retention impact that we can have by taking more of a design approach. The reason for that is 59% of the world's employees are not engaged. There's something we need to fix. It's something that we need to do differently, quite desperately. And I do think taking more of a PX approach is a way that we can also add that humanity back in. We've lost that massively as a function because we're too focused on compliance and admin and transactional and, like you said with the coffee shop, on to the next.
Mm-hmm.
We've lost that human connection. Have you found that connection has been enhanced by taking more of a people experience approach?
Definitely. I think I've had a number of people now say to me, like, thank me when I've involved them in things. I think it's undervalued that even just having people participate in the design of these solutions can increase engagement and that sense of satisfaction at work. There have been so many people that, even though we haven't been able to act on their feedback, or even though the solution maybe wasn't quite what they initially thought it might be, it's by having been part of the process and treated like someone whose opinion was worth listening to and whose experience was worth understanding, that they actually became much more positive about the world of work, and that they weren't just another number, but someone who was a human with, some value to add.
And what are the most common challenges that you face with people experience, especially for scaling businesses?
In terms of the design process?
Yes, the design process.
I think it is really about how quickly you can deliver a lot of the time. I think in smaller businesses that are scaling quickly, they're trying to create impact really quickly, and these processes aren't as simple as just taking something off the shelf and implementing it. And even if you do that, sometimes it doesn't have the intended impact. So the challenge can be in gaining buy-in for taking a little bit more time to truly understand the problem and iterating on those solutions. What I have found is that often, if I gave that example of the symptoms before and treating the symptom or the root cause, sometimes you do need to treat the symptom whilst also making some time for treating root causes. And I think in the world of HR especially, you can become very reactive, right? If you've got, for example, lots of people who in their first 6 months aren't performing that well, you might get caught up in a lot of kind of cases around that. And then that feels like it's taking up all of your time and you can't deliver anything from a people experience perspective. But actually, all you need to do is maybe take an hour and a half each morning to spend a bit of time to understand, why are we having this underperformance issue in the first 6 months? Is it that actually our candidate experience isn't quite right and we're not hiring people based on the right skills for the job? Or is it maybe in the onboarding process that we aren't setting really clear expectations about what performance looks like? And then if you can start to unpick that a little bit, you can try to find what the real problem is, put some solutions in place that then give you time back over time because you've solved the problem. So I think, it is very much about, especially in scaling businesses, finding ways to treat the symptom, but also make time for that kind of root cause analysis.
And making time, I think, is definitely on people's agenda at the moment. We don't feel like we have enough time. But you're absolutely right. We're stuck in the weeds of the reactionary work, when really, if we took a step back and we got to the root cause, we'd uncover and discover so much more about the experience that we're creating. And is that an experience we're actually really proud of? I think that's a question we should be asking.
Yes, absolutely. And I really like to think of it as almost like your well-being, right? Sometimes we don't feel like we have time to go to the gym or cook a healthy meal, but if we get into the habit of not doing those things over time, then it impacts our health. That's the exact same in an organization. Our role is to really build a healthy organization that is delivering results and performing at their best. And if we aren't taking the time to make sure that we're creating the conditions where people can perform at their best, then we're not doing the best that we could be doing. And we have to ask ourselves, are we making the time for that people experience approach?
I love that. My brain, I've got so many thoughts and so many questions. I'm thinking, where do I start? I want to take it back, and I'm thinking of our listeners, as I mentioned at the start, who potentially have never heard of people experience. Do you have any tips or recommendations or any design strategies where we could start as a foundation to get this started?
My recommendation would be probably to take some time to understand the design process. So there's a framework that I really love called the Systemic Design Framework by the Design Council. And it has a bunch of different pieces in here. The first is really understanding what you're trying to achieve. What's the vision? What's the business outcome that you're trying to achieve? And that can be as simple as spending an hour with some of your business leaders and getting a sense of what matters to them, what keeps them up at night. Then the next step is around doing some discovery work, understanding user needs. So this could be, again, as simple as something that I was doing I tend to do in all of my roles now, is create a booking link where people can spend 15 minutes to half an hour with me. And I have a list of questions around things like what matters to you in terms of your communication preferences, what matters to you when it comes to your well-being at work, all of the different facets of people experience. And we pick 3 and we just talk about them. And if you do that on a regular basis, you really get a sense of who your people are and who you're designing for. And then you can use that data in your various projects, or you can even use those calls based on whatever project you're working on. And then there's a really great framework around, I guess, defining problem statements called how might we statements. It's where you translate a problem into a how might we solution, a how might we statement. And you can then use those statements to brainstorm. Okay, so for example, we spoke earlier about if the problem is, okay, we're trying to boost career progression at work, and we speak to our people, and what they really care about is seeing their career path forwards in the organization. What's the problem statement? Is it that right now they don't have a clear career path? And the how might we statement then is, how could we create clarity and visibility over where people can take their careers? I'm not sure that was the best answer.
I also can imagine that taking more of a involvement design approach, getting the buy-in from the team, having those booking calls that you mentioned, also really helps when the product is ready, the usage uptake. And I'm definitely thinking from my experience here where I have created a new strategy, all bells and whistles. I thought it would be really great. And the reality is it's not fit for purpose. But actually, on reflection, if I'd have involved people sooner in the process, if I'd have tested that product with them, they probably understood a lot more behind why we're bringing this in. Because we're doing those test and learn conversations, it's more regular. And I feel like that's such a missing piece of HR.
You've hit the nail on the head there. I think we so often go into our little box and design in isolation, and then we launch something and we're like, ta-da, here it is. And everyone's like, that wasn't really what we were expecting.
Yes.
Or it doesn't meet the need. Whereas if you involve people in the process, I've definitely found that it gives you an opportunity to explain why you're doing that piece of work. Also, it's a great opportunity to show, for example, if you run pulse surveys or engagement surveys and you're directly responding to feedback by working on that particular initiative, you can say, we heard in the survey that only 40% of people are satisfied that our benefits meet their personal needs. And so we're doing a piece of work to understand what your personal needs are and how our benefits could better support them. And just by doing that, you're already showing that you're taking a people-centered approach. And then you can have more of an impact because you learn what their personal needs are and how you can address them. And then when you launch it, you've already built some advocates for those solutions who can then help to share the word with other people as well.
I'd be really interested to know on that because I think it's a really good point. Sometimes when we get feedback from surveys, let's use our example of benefits, and there are suggestions within that feedback which are really great in theory, practicality, maybe not. However, where I think people experience adds value is you're taking people through the process of, does this work? what is actually the reality of this, compared with potentially just not even introducing it as an option or a suggestion, which you may then get resistance and disgruntlement and disengagement. Have you found in cases when potentially the products don't work that you get a better response?
I think it's probably more, I mean, you spoke there about when someone puts forward a solution that isn't viable
Yep.
or feasible, right? I've definitely had that. And there's another model I really love called the service gaps model. It essentially says that your satisfaction is the gap between what you expect and what you experience. And there are different ways you can close that gap. One of which is sometimes setting better expectations about what is possible at that point in time. And again, just having listened to people and saying, we've heard you, that this would be something of value. And right now we don't have the capacity or, the funds or whatever it is to be able to provide that solution. But we've understood that your need is this, and here's what we could do instead, or here's what we are doing to try and solve that problem. I think that actually can go a long way to helping people feel better about the solution because, again, you've taken the time to listen to them and show that you're responding in some way. Sometimes I think, especially leaders who aren't in the people space, feel like they don't want to address that feedback head on. They can almost shy away from it. And I would very much recommend always acknowledging the feedback that's been given and giving some transparency around why we can't do that, because that's ultimately what people want, is they want to feel like they're able to have some understanding of the decision-making process, I suppose.
You just mentioned around the comms strategy. How important is it to have a comms strategy as part of building the employee experience and the design strategy?
Hugely important. I was actually talking about this with one of my colleagues the other day, is that when you're designing either your end-to-end experience or different parts within it, you shouldn't just be designing the experience of that solution, but also how people are communicated with. And that in itself could have a whole lot of research done around how do people like to be communicated with? What do they expect? We at the BBC, for example, have some people who don't have a computer or a device because they're camera people behind a camera. They're not looking at their emails all the time. We need to communicate initiatives with them very differently to how we communicate with a UX designer, for example, who's sitting behind a screen every day. So I think it's hugely important to treat your communication almost as an experience in itself that needs to be designed.
Amazing. Megan, I have one final question, which I feel like we could go on and on about this. This PX is definitely something that I hope all of our listeners now get onto their radar. But my final question to you is, looking back on your career, what is one piece of advice you would give your younger self?
I think to have courage.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important to just have a go at things. The only way you learn, I think, or the best, maybe not the only way, but the best way that you can learn is through practice.
Mm-hmm.
and being really open-minded to the fact that you're not perfect and you're not going to get things right the first time. And sometimes you think that you're right or that you know the answer when in actual fact, maybe you're missing a piece of the puzzle. So I think I can add two things in there. One is, courage and open-mindedness.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. I've absolutely loved this conversation, and I know our listeners will as well. And if you want any more advice or suggestions on people experience, then you can definitely find Megan on LinkedIn. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Like this episode? Click here for more HR talk. And if you're just catching up, check out our previous episodes right here.